We're talking about teaching, and a nominating committee was interviewing a prospective pastor. And I think it would have been similar to what happened about 10 and a half years ago, Brother Jerry, as you guys were in that process. And Lord willing, we won't have to go through that process for many decades from now. But as this particular pastor was before the nominating committee, they asked him, "Do you know the Bible?" "I sure do," the young pastor, prospective pastor replied. And these guys said, "Preach something to us right now and make it something that we'll never forget." And he got nervous, Brother Jimmy, and he says, "Right here in front of you? Now?" He goes, "Now." I'm not saying that was the right thing to do, but the guy then proceeds to say, "There was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus who went down to Jericho by night and fell on stony ground. And the thorns sprang up and choked him and left him half dead. He then said," for those of you who are kind of confused, he's kind of conglomerating a ton of Bible stories right now, okay, so just FYI. He then said, "What shall I now do? I shall arise and go to my father's house." And he arose and climbed up into a sycamore tree. And he was afterward hungered, and the ravens came and fed him. The next day, Solomon and his wife, Gomorrah, came by, and they carried him down to the ark for Moses to take care of. And as he was going through the eastern gate, he caught his hair on a limb and hung there for 40 days and 40 nights. The next day, the 3 wise men came and carried him down to Nineveh. And when he got there, he saw Delilah sitting on the wall. He looked up and said, "Chuck her down, boys." And they said, "How many times shall we chuck her down? Till 7 times? And he responded, "Nay, but 70 times 70 times. And they chucked her down 490 times until she burst asunder in their midst. And great was the fall thereof, and the fragments that remained were 12 baskets full. But whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Let him that hath an ear hear." And then he sat down. I think you'd agree with me that this young man reached his goal of preaching something that they would never forget. But I don't know how much of a help he was to them. And that's what we're getting at tonight. He was very entertaining, but he taught them nothing. It was probably a fun little time to be in there, but it taught them nothing. And so as we think about teaching tonight, I want us to look at this 8th gift, on whose gift is this. So let's talk about a good definition first, all right? So I always want to give our teens a good definition, a good example, and a good use of the gift. So a good definition is pretty simple. Now, biblically speaking, we'll go back to the Greek root word, which literally means didasko. All right, now that means nothing to us unless you've studied Greek, but the definition of that Greek word is this, and I think you understand: to hold discourse with others in order to instruct them, okay? To impart knowledge. That's the Bible definition of this Greek word that's translated into the word teach that we see in Scripture here. It's used 95 times in the New Testament. And as a pastor, as a husband, as a dad, I try to use this gift of teaching to build the knowledge of the will of God into the people's lives until they're conformed into the image of Christ. As a pastor, as a dad, as a husband, I am trying to get them to grasp the why behind the what. That's what teaching does. If we're not careful, obedience is good, but obedience is really good for the individual. But understanding helps the whole. Because we can say, you're going to do this because Daddy said so, and I think they should obey. But if the children can understand why Daddy is saying so, it would help so much more. As a coach, we can make a player. Well, that's the team rule, son, and we're doing it this way. And we can make that one individual obey. But if the whole team understands, then there's accountability. And the teammates are saying, no, you can't be late. Remember, we got to make sure we get there on time. We got to make sure the team rules state this. And so understanding helps the whole. And understanding only comes by teaching. And so that's why it's such an important word we see here. Of the 90 times Jesus was addressed directly, 60 of them he was called teacher. Jesus is the good example. Jesus is the best example of teacher. You know what's amazing? He's our Savior. He's Master. He's the lily of the valley. We can go through. He's the day star. We can go through all the names. But he was most often called Rabbi or teacher. And so as we look at this lesson here, one of the most common names that he's given here, look at Matthew chapter 7, if you will. It's at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 7, and we'll look at the last verses there, verses 28 and 29. Matthew chapter 7, verse 28 and 29. So for the previous chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7, all throughout here, it's the Beatitudes, right? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And then he talks about the kingdom of heaven is like unto, and then he refers to the law of Moses, and on and on and on and on. And he teaches them. And he's done teaching now, and look at verse 28 and 29, what they say about his lesson. Verse 28. And it came to pass when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were, what's the next word there, class? Astonished at his doctrine. For he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Now, Preacher White and I worked at a Bible college, and I didn't teach the hermeneutics. I didn't teach the contemporary theology classes like he did. But I would dare say those are very difficult classes, preacher, to hold a student's attention who are just taking it because it's a required class as opposed to those who sign up and want to take it. Some of our high school classes, Brother Nathan, might be a little difficult for the students to stay engaged pre-COVID, right? Not non-online, all that stuff. All of you teachers know what I'm talking about. Some, you need to utilize some tools to make sure they stay engaged. Jesus taught for these 3 chapters, and at the end, these folks were astonished at doctrine. At doctrine. Because, here's why, he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. The scribes were clerks. The scribes were copiers. They took the law of Moses, and we need more copies, and literally that was their job. They were just stamping approvals over and rewriting exactly what this said, so this area could have the law of Moses. And then this area need the law of Moses. So then they would just copy it over. They were pretty boring, if I could say it that way. Their mundane job was just same old. It's like most clerks you would go to probably any federal office when you stand in line and go up there and you just stand there and you're waiting and you just look at the happiness behind the desk about where you're about to be in a few minutes and just how they just love their job. And then you hear those words, next. And you're like, I haven't even done it. I hope I don't get the repercussion from the previous customer from this worker on me. In a sense, that's how the scribes were. They weren't really, you wouldn't say this scribe is a people person. There's a reason he wanted to be a scribe and around books and not people, right? And so when Jesus taught them, they said he taught as one having authority, not as the scribes. And so when we see this, now listen, the teachings as we see here, it's bigger than a classroom. I want to make sure we understand, I'm not just talking about the education area of a teacher, but it's much more than that. How about the teaching parent here tonight? How about the teaching spouse tonight? He's so hard-headed, he don't listen. Oh, that's not true. Some of you spouses, male and female, have figured out how to teach them without them knowing you taught them, which is a masterful thing to do, and it prolongs marriages as well. You have that sneaky way of just asking the right questions that wind up reminding your spouse without you reminding your spouse. You know what I'm saying? So I'm talking about the teaching parent tonight. I'm talking about the teaching spouse. I'm talking about the teaching friend. Right? Nobody likes a friend who's always telling us what to do, but some of us do have friends who teach us a lot. And in their unique way of wisdom, it's amazing if you watch it. How about this, the teaching child? Well, kids are supposed to obey parents. I understand that. What about kids who come to teen church whose mom and dads aren't saved? So are they supposed to obey everything mom and dad says? What if it violates scripture principle? What if it violates a moral principle? And so there's several ways we can see how can we all are teachers. I want us to understand that is what I'm saying. The teaching nursery worker, the teaching bus worker, the teaching usher, Any area you want, every life event can be a teaching moment. Every life event can be a teaching moment. How many times have you stood in line, dads, with your kids, and you saw some shenanigans taking place? You said, you see that? Yeah, that'll never happen. Everything's a teaching moment. The goal is not to be the example. The goal is to be the lesson learner, not the lesson. And so, how does one teach as one having authority, not as the scribes? 3 things about that. Number 1, know your subject. You can teach as one having authority if you know your subject. Your confidence in teaching is in direct proportion to your knowledge of the subject. Brother Joey Pegram, if I were to ask you and say, hey, in 10 minutes, I'm going to stop my message. I want you to come up here and just give me the basics and foundations of bricklaying. Could you do that? You could. Do you want to? I don't want to, preacher, but if you tell me to, I will. But no, Joey could do that. If I were to tell you to say, Joey, in 10 minutes, I want you to stand up here and explain to the church how Facebook works. What's the difference? His knowledge of the subject. I really don't want to talk about Facebook, Brother Clint. I mean, look, if you want me to stand up there, I'll talk about a face, I'll talk about a book, but I have no idea what Facebook is. I get it, that's fine. Because your confidence in teaching is always in direct proportion of your knowledge of the subject. So if we're going to be a teacher and one who has authority, not as the scribes, you've got to know your subject. Sunday school teachers who stand up and teach the Word of God. You know this much information for your lesson, even though you're only teaching this much. Right, Brother Jimmy? It's just to give, you're always, watch this, right? You're always loaded for bear, even if you only get squirrel. Like, thank you, preacher. You didn't know that California boy could do that, did you? And so you're not, know your subject, know your subject, know your subject. You got to know the way so you can go the way, and then you'll easily show the way. And so know your subject. The second thing, if you're going to get up and teach, you got to, and teach effect, you got to know your students or the crowd with which you're speaking to. Brother Jerry Beeson, could I teach a Bible lesson on David and Goliath in a junior church? Yes or no? Sure. I know since COVID, we stopped going to nursing homes. I understand that. But if I was going to a nursing home, Brother Jerry, could I teach on David and Goliath at a nursing home? Yeah. But if you're not familiar with your students, I may go to junior church and I may put Mason Ritchie on a chair to symbolize Goliath, and Eli Ritchie just standing on the floor so the kids could understand the David and Goliath difference, correct? But if I go to a nursing home, I'm not putting Edna on a chair to stand next to Helga to show the difference. You got to know your students and know what they're capable of having taught to them. So not only do we need to know our subject, you need to know your students. How many of you understand that God made all of us individually different? Now, we can go back to the classroom, and you educators in here who teach realize that the subject matter that you know a lot about, that you're teaching, has to be given, and then you start to see as 80% of the class, the light bulb goes off. Now you're thinking, what do I got to do for these other 20%? And then you realize they're not all those 20% aren't the same. So you do this one idea to help that 20%, and only 10% of them get it. And so you try another avenue of teaching, and this last 10% finally gets it. And so we've got to know our students. And so hopefully, once the school year gets going and you start to understand your students and who they are and how they learn and how they receive, that helps you to be a better teacher because now you know your students. Some learn differently than others. So as good teachers, we must find the road that gets them to the destination of understanding. As good teachers, we must find the road that gets them to the destination of understanding. I've got 3 children. And Debbie and I can look at one of our children. I'm using gender-neutral terms tonight, Dr. Seuss. And so I can look at one of our children, and we are making eye contact, Coach. We are just like this, and I'm saying everything, and our child is, yeah, And I'm like, okay, so we're leaving now. You got it? I got it. Then I got another child, and I'm giving instruction, and they're just like, hey, are you listening? Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah, look at me, okay? And then they look, and then I start talking to you, and they're like, and you know what's crazy? The first one who's locked in, yeah. They're the ones who forget things. And then the other child, they remembered everything. Why? Because we're all uniquely made different. And when we teach as a boss, when we teach as a parent, when we teach as a teacher, Sunday school teacher, bus worker, when we teach, we have to understand our students. And then third thing about this, to be an effective teacher and to teach as one having authority, know your subject, know your students, know your surroundings. Know your surroundings as well. The knowledge of your surroundings will help you in your planning and presentation of your lesson. I forgot how many years it's been, honey. I did that teen camp in Hawaii. And I know you think Hawaii, but we went up to the mountains, and they stayed in these big tents, these brown tents that had about 10 cots in each tent. And I was really excited about that. And I can't even get away from not camping in Hawaii. And every lesson was, they went camping for camp. And every lesson was around a little amphitheater of rocks that were set up. And the funny thing was, the year before I had gone, this one preacher had come, and he had PowerPoint presentations and slides and everything he wanted to show them. And he's like, I got this jump drive but I can't show them my lessons. Every time I travel, every time I preach, I'm asking 150, where are we meeting? What kind of setting is it? Is this available? Is that available? Now, I'm pretty basic. I'm pretty easy. I'm normally just bring my Bible, have my notes, and I'm not against those, new fandangled preachers who use an iPad when they preach or anything of that nature. I'm just a Bible and note guy, really. And so I'm pretty simple and basic, but I still want to know where's the area. I've been asked to speak at Valentine's banquets at churches in their fellowship halls. Wonderful. Brother Tyler, I've been asked to speak at Valentine banquets that the church is having at a Golden Corral. Oh, yeah, it's wonderful. You got people walking by all the time because they got the section over by the restrooms. So you got to know your surroundings. Again, let's go back to the classroom. And some of you educators, you want to know, do I have a smart board? Do I have a dry erase board? I don't think we have chalkboards anymore in those schools, do we? And well, Coach John, East Surrey, a little bit slow on that? Okay, I'm sorry. A little bit. You do. Coach Johnson does, yeah. Afraid of technology, I guess. You don't get that nasty noise with the chalk, do you? Okay, sorry, I'm going to stop. Thinking camp meeting right now, honey. You need to get my food for me. Ugh. All right, and so know your subject, know your students, know your surroundings. Know your surroundings. As parents, you learn this real quick about your surroundings. Sometimes you're in an area, Joey, where your son or daughter acts up a little bit and you got to take care of business. Sometimes you know your surroundings and you're like, let's go to the restroom. Right? And so just be aware of your surroundings as you discipline and as you care and teach your children, your areas, know your surroundings. And so we see, lastly then, what's a good use of the gift? We saw a good definition. We saw a good example as Jesus Christ, who taught as one having authority and not as the scribes. And so what is a good use of the gift? Here we go. If we're going to teach, again, a good use of it is understanding the different avenues to get them to knowledge, to instruction, to understanding. So what is it? Here it is. Number one, teach with encouragement. You can teach with encouragement. And to inspire and fill with hope and courage, and to teach with encouragement. All your teaching doesn't mean, sit up straight, look up here, listen to me, nobody talking. Blah, 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 blah. That is needed sometimes. I get it, but not all the time. You can come in and teach with a smile. You can come in and teach and Miss Jennifer might come in and do a chorus for her class. Let's all sing. She brings that piano in and she starts mesmerizing junior church kids. It's unbelievable. Cheater. And but you can do, you can encourage. Teach with encouragement. Secondly, teach with correction. Correction is simply remedying a wrong. It's not a bad thing. It's getting them to understand. I love seeing that when it's being done by a 10th grader who is correcting someone on their junior day camp team and watching them handle it with such care because, we've told them all the horror stories about you can't mistreat children, and if you do, boy, they're going to take you to jail, and we'll call CLA, but we don't know if they're like, okay, yes, sir. And so listen, you remember when you ran over there after Brother Clint blew the whistle and we're supposed to line up? You weren't lining, and watching them trying to correct them is great. But once they do it once, they understand that it's for their benefit. And they stop feeling bad. I feel bad for No, you're helping them. Yeah, but I'm viewed as the bad person. No, you're not. You're remedying a wrong. Don't be fearful to correct someone because you're afraid it's going to hurt your friendship. You're afraid you're not going to be the fun teacher. You're afraid you're going to be the spouse, and now they're going to like my other spouse more than me because I'm always the one correcting it. No. It's good to correct. It remedies a wrong. What's another avenue to get them to understanding? Teach by warning. Now, correction remedies the wrong. Warning faithfully alerts them before they've done wrong. No, don't go down that way. No, turn around. No, bridge out. Stop your car. That's a warning, and it's different than correction. And then, of course, I said instruction. Teach with instruction. The process of imparting knowledge. That's what our goal is, imparting knowledge so they have understanding. Again, if all you do is teach, you obey me because that's what I said, that's all you'll get. And then when you're not around, Katie, bar the door. Because you've taught them, that's what I said, so they only obey you. Well, what happens when you drop them off at school and now their teacher is in charge? What happens when they go on a Freedom Kids youth activity and Brother Drew is in charge? What happens when they go on a youth activity and Brother Clint, quote unquote, is in charge? And because Brother Clint, because you're not saying it, we've not taught them, you obey the authority that God has placed in front of you. We're teaching them a principle to live by other than just, because I said so. Teaching. The mediocre teacher tells, the good teacher explains, the superior teacher demonstrates, and the great teacher inspires. Good teaching must be slow enough so that it is not confusing, and fast enough so that it's not boring. You have to find that happy medium so you can be an effective teacher. When I was in the 9th and 10th grade, Brother Nathan, what age group do you teach? 10th and 11th. All right, so this might hit home, and I'm not targeting you, but just follow me on this. When I was in 9th and 10th grade, I heard some of the most frightening language I had ever heard up until that day in my life. When I say frightening language, I mean something like this. In the figure below, triangle OAB has an area of 72, and triangle ODC has an area of 288. Find X and Y. Geometry. Algebra was no better. Find the points of intersection of the two parabolas with equation y equals negative, in parentheses, x minus 3 squared plus 2, and y equals x squared minus 4x plus 1. Will not compute, danger, danger. I asked my mom, I literally tried to get kicked out of school. She has that report card. You know, my mom, if you're watching, Mom, get rid of the clutter. And when I go visit, she goes, you remember this report card? Yeah, it was during this time of the year. I didn't have one passing grade. When I say passing, nothing of a C or higher. I was trying to get kicked out of school because of this horrible language they were speaking in those schoolrooms. And then I had that great conversation with my geometry teacher, Mr. Fizz. Yes, whatever you think Mr. Fizz looks like, that's what he looked like. And he was a good geometry teacher. I screamed out in the middle of class. A timid, shy person like me, this is not my personality at all. But I was looking at a problem, and I just literally sat there. Now, teenagers, do not do this. I just literally yelled, I hate geometry! Everyone's looking at me. I don't know why. Mr. Fizz goes, he wore his glasses like I do when I read. He had them right. He goes, Mr. Fredericks, why don't you step outside right now? And I'm thinking, step outside? Oh, you want some of this smoke, old man? Here we go, let's go. We're standing on a balcony on this gymnasium, and he looks over at me. He goes, what seems to be the problem? That is the problem. All these problems. X's and Y's and parabolas and the descent of the ark. I said, when am I ever going to use this in life? Right? Oh, don't tell me you've never asked that question. Or at least you thought it. He looked at me over his glasses. I contacted his daughter through Facebook to relay this story as it was working on me. And I said, please relay this to your dad. And I said, this is so stupid, we're never going to use this stuff. And he just looked at me, and I remember vividly, he said something like this: maybe you won't use this. Maybe you will. But I guarantee you, Clint, you will spend the rest of your life trying to solve problems. And that's what geometry is all about. I finally learned something in geometry. The light bulb went off. For about 37 years since that day, I've been learning to solve problems as a husband. X and Y, and trying to figure out how this is not the answer we're getting. As a dad, I've been trying to learn to solve problems. And I have found that the more I can teach those who are around me, the fewer problems there are to handle. There'll never be a day of no problems. Man that is born a woman is full of trouble as sparks fly upward. But we can solve the problems if you'll just get to a good teacher. Mr. Fizz revolutionized. Look, there's no happy ending like, and then I made the honor roll. Nope. And my GPA was nope. And he made who's who, and I didn't even make what's what in America, okay? But I did get a diploma, and I was just as surprised as my parents when I opened up that thing and I said, it's in there. Hey. But I learned what a good teacher was. Mr. Fizz probably taught. He retired from Rocketdyne, which is a government-age thing there in Woodland Hills, and worked on some of those early space shuttles in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the groundwork for that. And then he retired at like age 30-something and just wound up getting into teaching and taught at that school that I attended for over 30 years. He's retired now, lives up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I thanked him today. I thanked my teacher. You teachers understand that you sow seeds that you'll never see the full crop during your tenure. As those students graduate and move on, some of those lessons you've taught don't really take hold for years. I think that's what youth pastoring's like. We quote unquote get them as knuckleheads, and then they graduate and move on, and then it's when you see them several years after, and the young adults God's turned them into, and the lessons they've acquired and applied to their lives. Teaching. All of us teach. Some in a classroom, some at a place of business, some teach here in church, but all of us teach with our actions. All these little kids that run around after a service, number one, it's a blessing. Number two, they're watching everything you do. They're watching the person over here. They're watching the person come down from the back. They're watching it. My wife has to remind me that, honey, the kids are watching. Oh, yep, sorry. Preacher told on me, and I snuck up to the balcony and threw that airplane. It almost hit Preacher, I'm sorry. But those Herbert kids were up there in a heartbeat. Why? Brother Clint did it. We're all teaching. So I said, boys, this was wrong. Okay, Preacher left, but just one throw each, but this is wrong, and we won't do this anymore after this. Do you understand? So I was trying to teach. Parents, your kids are watching. Well, I tell my kids to do this, but what do they see? Grandparents, your kids are watching. Your grandkids are watching. Coach, your players are watching. Boss, your employees are watching. On and on and on and on and on. Whose gift is this teaching? It's all of ours. You have the gift of teaching. Well, I'm not good at it. Get better. Work at it. because all of us are teachers. Our heads are bowed, our eyes are closed.